Russia has tried to topple the government of Armenia. A few days ago, the Armenian authorities launched investigations into 7 individuals related to a failed coup attempt. 3 of them have already been detained. Russia has not yet reacted to the allegations. These developments fit into the larger picture, though, as the relations between Armenia and Russia have soured. Recently, Armenia's premier said the two nations were reaching a point of no return. The problems have to do with a conflict between Armenia and its neighbor, Azerbaijan. Armenia is supposed to get military support from Russia under the CSTO alliance. But when it felt that it was attacked by Azerbaijan, Moscow gave them the cold shoulder. In retaliation, Armenia froze its participation in the CSTO alliance. Anti-Russian sentiment is growing in the country, and the government is turning increasingly to its new Western allies. Putin, he didn't like this, and perhaps he even ordered a coup because of these tensions. As we all know by now, he believes in a Russian sphere of influence, and Armenia definitely falls into this sphere of his. The failed takeover is a story of conflict, betrayal, and complicated geopolitics. But before we move on with the video, I'd like to ask you something. To support the channel, please hit the like button below. YouTube doesn't like videos about controversial topics like this, but you guys can help out a ton with the algorithm. All right, without further ado, let's get into it. We don't know the exact details of the coup attempt, as it's still currently under investigation. Allegedly, the suspects were in Russia for 3 months to participate in some kind of training. For a while, they were at the Arbat military base in Rostov-on-Don in southern Russia. There, they would have learned how to use weaponry. The suspects received a monthly salary of 220,000 rubles, or a little over $2,000 US, from the Russian authorities. In a country like Armenia, well, that's a lot of money, way more than the average person makes. After they returned, the individuals under investigation tried to recruit even more people for their coup attempt. The suspects will be charged with preparing to assert power, using violence, and the threat of violence to take over the powers of government. How this coup would have played out will probably remain a mystery. It could have involved an attempt on Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan's life, and this would give a candidate more favorable to Russia the opportunity to take over. Armenia's political situation is already quite fragile, with mass protests relating to the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict. There are genuine fears that the opposition in Armenia could topple the government on its own. The movement is led by the country's Archbishop, Bagrat Galitstanyan. He's a powerful figure in the Armenian Apostolic Church, one of the oldest institutions in the world, and still incredibly influential in Armenian society. The Archbishop is becoming more and more powerful, as he recently organized a rally with thousands of people in the nation's capital of Yerevan. For a nation of only 3 million, well, that's a lot of people. He also called for an impeachment vote by the Armenian parliament and announced that he would like to run for office. He even temporarily stepped down from his religious work to focus on this. A small problem is that he is a dual citizen with both a Canadian and an Armenian passport, which makes him ineligible for office. But perhaps there are ways to work around that. His movement wants a tougher policy on Azerbaijan, and they disagree with the concessions Pashinyan made recently. He gave up 4 deserted border villages to cool down the tensions and move towards a peace deal, which nationalist Armenians don't like. Also, the Archbishop's movement is disappointed in the military defeats that Armenia suffered under Pashinyan. Many people in the country view his government as highly incompetent. But most importantly, the Archbishop doesn't mind restarting ties with Russia, as he called for a new dialogue with Moscow. A key takeaway here is that there is a popular leader willing to take over Pashinyan's role, even in the case of a violent overthrow, and that Moscow would rather have him in power than the one currently in government. The Russian state media are not hiding that they like the protest movement that's underway currently. It's worth looking at what exactly went wrong between Putin and Pashinyan, though. Now, before we get into that, I quickly wanted to answer a question that we got asked. A lot of you guys, you want to start your own YouTube channel, but you're camera shy or just not comfortable putting your face out there. In fact, this channel is a perfect example, and that's why this channel has no face on it. Luckily, you can still grow on YouTube even without showing your face or giving up your privacy. This channel is living proof of that. In fact, here are just a few examples of channels that started in the last 12 months and grew an audience without showing their face. They have gotten millions of views and made thousands of dollars from them. And now we recently crossed 1 million subscribers. And along the way, we have learned a few tips and tricks about YouTube that could be helpful for any of you who want to start your own channel. We've included all this in my completely free 7-day YouTube Crash Bootcamp. So, if you're someone who's interested in starting a YouTube channel, this is the perfect starting point for you. What better way to convince you than to read a comment left by a previous student? This free bootcamp is better than a paid course he took. So if you're interested in signing up, you can sign up now for free by clicking on the link in the description or scanning the QR code on the screen. Back in 2018, things seemed all right between the two national leaders. Prime Minister Pashinyan got into office in a bit of a shaky way, namely with the 2018 Armenian Revolution. He was a leader in anti-government protests against the then Prime Minister and his Armenian Republican Party. The former government resigned in a peaceful manner, and Pashinyan was able to take over. It was similar to many other revolutions in post-Soviet nations called the Color Revolutions. The one in Armenia was named the Velvet Revolution. Despite his democratic values and his pro-Western tendencies, Pashinyan and Putin seemed to get along fine initially. The two leaders met in Moscow in 2018, where they talked about their nations' excellent relations and their growing mutual trade. Both agreed that Russia and Armenia should continue to work forward with political, economic, and military cooperation. It was a bit awkward, though, to have Pashinyan in office in Yerevan. The Armenian leader famously took this selfie with the leaders of the Eurasian Economic Union. They're probably not used to taking selfies, but most importantly, they're not used to dealing with a guy like him. The fact that he rose to power through a popular uprising is a bit uncomfortable for leaders from Belarus, Russia, Iran, amongst others. Opposition protests are the nightmare scenario for any dictator. However, the real cracks only began to show in 2020. It had to do with the military alliance between Russia and Armenia, amongst others, called the CSTO, or the Collective Security Treaty Organization. Just like in NATO, the members of the alliance are supposed to protect each other. In the case of the CSTO, it's almost a security guarantee from Russia's side, considering the sheer size of the Kremlin's military. But it turned out that the security guarantee was empty. This became obvious with the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, which was a ticking time bomb. Just for context, we have to understand that the Caucasus region is a bit of a mess, and that it's been unstable for hundreds of years. It's hard to get borders that reflect the ethnic divisions in the region. There are dozens of groups and subgroups, each with their own culture and history. This map shows the ethnic divisions back in the 19th century, so it's always been very complicated. In recent times, Armenia and Azerbaijan have clashed regularly over who owns what, based on historical and ethnic arguments. One of their biggest disputes is this region inside Azerbaijan, called Nagorno-Karabakh, or the Republic of Artsakh. The majority of the 120,000 people living there are Armenian Christians. With an area of 1,700 square miles, or about 4,400 square kilometers, it's quite big, considering the size of these nations. The area is internationally recognized as a territory of Azerbaijan, but for a long time it stayed autonomous. In Soviet times, the Nagorno-Karabakh Oblast was part of the Azerbaijani Soviet Socialist Republic, but it had some form of self-governance. During the Soviet Union's collapse, however, a full-scale war between Armenia and Azerbaijan erupted. A 1991 referendum showed that the vast majority of people in the enclave wanted to join Armenia, but Azerbaijan, they didn't recognize it. After years of fighting, Nagorno-Karabakh was effectively won by the pro-Armenian side, although it was recognized by no one. Armenia and the independence forces also occupied about 9% of Azerbaijan's territory outside of Nagorno-Karabakh to support the enclave. The war displaced an estimated 350,000 Armenians and 500,000 Azerbaijanis. In 1994, Russia stepped in to broker a ceasefire to prevent it from getting any further out of hand. Although the conflict cooled down, nothing was really fixed, as there were still regular clashes even decades later. From 2008 onwards, small fights broke out just about every year. It was all bound to go wrong, as Azerbaijan grew stronger during this time. And there was one reason for this: oil and gas. The country is blessed with huge amounts of natural resources, including a proven oil reserve of 7 billion barrels, and a proven natural gas reserve of 2.6 trillion cubic meters. In 1994, an international consortium agreed to invest billions into Azerbaijan's energy sector, which was named the Contract of the Century. Production picked up in the 2000s. A new pipeline was created, transporting Azeri oil into Europe through Georgia and Turkey. Right now, oil and gas make up more than 90% of the nation's exports and 1/3 of its GDP. As it turns out, this oil and gas money can buy you guns. The government of Azerbaijan has increased its defense budget to the point where they are spending 4 to 8 times that of Armenia. The budget fluctuates heavily because of changing oil prices, but you get the point. Azerbaijan has been investing in its military so that someday it could take over the disputed territories. What only helped is that Azerbaijan's population has grown, while Armenia's population only declined. Azerbaijan now has a clear edge strength-wise. In 2020, it decided to test this out in a new war. Azerbaijan attacked on September 27th, almost 4 years ago today. The fighting didn't go well for Armenia. They were overwhelmed by Azerbaijan's heavy artillery, rockets, and combat drones. This mix of artillery, missiles, and UAVs was in many ways similar to the current Ukraine war. The big difference is that both sides agreed to a ceasefire, less than 2 months into the conflict. Azerbaijan has achieved most of its objectives, recapturing 73% of the disputed territory. Most of it was territory around the Republic of Artsakh itself, which Armenia captured in the 1994 war. But Azerbaijan also took control over about a third of the enclave, namely some less mountainous parts in the north and the south of the region. In the end, the war has cost over 6,000 casualties, nearly 4,000 Armenians, and 3,000 Azerbaijanis. When the war ended, there was a lot of political unrest in Armenia. The people were disappointed in their prime minister and their government. Some thought he backed off too soon and gave too many concessions. This included high-ranking people in Armenia's military. The chief of the General Staff of the Armed Forces allegedly planned a coup d'etat in 2021, together with 40 other military officers. They had called for the prime minister's resignation before, which is not something that the military is supposed to do. They had a lot of public support, though, as the population was feeling resentful about the military loss. There were even mass protests in Yerevan calling for the leader's resignation. But Pashinyan himself was likely feeling just as bitter about the CSTO alliance. According to Article 4 of the Collective Security Treaty, Russia should have come to Armenia's defense in the case of an attack. Now, this was a special situation, of course, because Russia doesn't recognize Artsakh neither as Armenian nor as an independent territory. So Pashinyan had to be satisfied with Russian diplomatic support for now. Vladimir Putin was one of the co-signatories of the ceasefire agreement, and he hosted the talks in November of 2020. Russia also sent a peacekeeper force of a little less than 2,000 soldiers to the Lachin corridor. This small territory connects Armenia with their territory in Nagorno-Karabakh. The Russian soldiers protected this vulnerable area against attacks from Azerbaijan, and their presence calmed down the fighting. In November of 2022, Putin visited Yerevan for an important CSTO summit. This will probably have been the last time that he stepped foot in the country. Anti-Russian sentiment was already growing in Armenia back then, with protests in Yerevan against Putin. They were waving the flags of Ukraine and the Republic of Artsakh. But in Armenia's eyes, the true betrayal of Russia happened later. Azerbaijan repeatedly showed that it wasn't going to respect the terms of the ceasefire agreement. In December of 2022, it blocked Nagorno-Karabakh from the outside world, and it sabotaged civilian infrastructure in the enclave. This went on for 9 months, and it sparked a humanitarian crisis for the 120,000 residents that were living there. There were shortages of essential goods, and things like water and electricity had to be rationed. Even the Red Cross and Russian peacekeepers were barred from importing goods. The blockade was condemned by multiple nations and international organizations, and some even called it an attempt of genocide. There were also signs that Azerbaijan would launch a new military assault, as its president, Aliyev, ordered all men aged 18 or older to report to a military base. On the 19th of September, 2023, these fears came to reality. Azerbaijan launched an offensive with the aim of the complete dissolution of the Republic of Artsakh. Heavy shelling killed dozens of citizens, and Azerbaijan was once again accused of ethnic cleansing. The next day, the offensive was already over as the local forces were absolutely overwhelmed. Russian peacekeepers once again negotiated a ceasefire, but it was pretty clear who had won. That evening, the Azeri president Aliyev said that his iron fist had put the idea of an independent Nagorno-Karabakh in the history books. The Armenian forces later handed down their weapons to the Russian peacekeepers, and Azerbaijan slowly but surely took control over the region. President Aliyev raised his flag in the regional capital, Stepanakert, and also released a video of him stepping on the local Artsakh Armenian flag. Later, one of the streets in the city was insultingly named after Enver Pasha. This was an Ottoman military leader who was one of the architects of the Armenian genocide. The Ottomans killed 600,000 to 1.5 million ethnic Armenians in the early 20th century. I'm not going to go into details here, but it was one of the most horrendous events in history. Many Armenians still fear genocide to this day, and the people living in Nagorno-Karabakh decided to flee from the enemy's hands. The ceasefire brokered by the Russian peacekeeping forces gave them a window to do this, and more than 99% of the population fled over the following days. Armenia called this an ethnic cleansing, because effectively more than 100,000 people were stripped from their homeland. It also claims that Azerbaijan is erasing all traces of ethnic Armenians' presence and destroying important cultural sites. Armenian lawyers have stated a case against Azerbaijan at the National Court of Justice of the United Nations. After the Republic of Artsakh was completely lost, the relations between Armenia and Russia really started to go sideways. The Russian peacekeeping forces had failed in their mission, and Putin's backing of the ceasefire agreement proved to be worth nothing. Armenia asked for support from Russia through the CSTO's Article 4, but Putin refused to send help. In April of 2024, the remaining Russian peacekeeper forces left Nagorno-Karabakh, and the area has been fully under Azerbaijan's control ever since. This was a historic milestone, as Russian peacekeepers have been present in and around the area for about 3 decades. With the complete loss of Artsakh, all the goodwill towards Moscow was gone. Another grievance is that Azerbaijan now occupies up to 83 square miles, or about 215 square kilometers, of internationally recognized sovereign Armenian territory. The CSTO was supposed to protect Armenia against this. A recent 2-day visit of Putin to Azerbaijan's capital city of Baku only made the Russia-Armenia relations worse. He wanted to continue his role as a mediator, claiming that if we can do something to sign a peace agreement between Azerbaijan and Armenia, we will be very happy to. Aliyev said that the new situation opens up new opportunities for establishing a lasting peace in the South Caucasus. That's not something that Yerevan would agree with, though, as it just witnessed more than 100,000 people lose their homes. Russia as a mediator is a very unrealistic idea, as it's clear that Putin's communications with the Armenian government have turned cold. By the way, it's very odd and suspicious that he visited Azerbaijan before his traditional ally after this conflict unfolded. Perhaps he is switching his position to form a much more lucrative alliance with President Aliyev. In the very same visit, Putin and Aliyev discussed joint initiatives on oil transportation. After all, with this Nagorno-Karabakh problem out of the way, there is much less dividing Russia and Azerbaijan. Ultimately, this led Prime Minister Pashinyan to switch up his alliances too. Armenia's government is quickly turning to the West for new partnerships, as a result of the Nagorno-Karabakh tensions. It's no secret that Nikol Pashinyan has some pro-Western sympathies, but only recently did he put the West over Russia. He has signed partnerships with the European Union, including a €270 million investment deal with Brussels. Also, they are starting negotiations on visa-free travel. Recently, Armenia's PM said that if we see a more or less realistic possibility of becoming a full member of the European Union, we will not miss that moment. This is an indirect attack on Russia's influence in Armenia. Russia is still Armenia's largest trade partner by far, which is the cornerstone of its influence in the nation. Much of this has to do with the Eurasian Economic Union, a free trade zone between Belarus, Russia, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Armenia. When Armenia joins the European Union, however, its former trade partners will probably be replaced. The EU's market is just way bigger than the Eurasian one, with a combined GDP of $19 trillion compared to that of less than $3 trillion. And if its economic ties with Armenia get cut, it could mean the end of Russia's influence in the nation. Just as important is the military aspect of the relations with Russia. A few months ago, Armenia launched joint military drills with the US called Eagle Partners 2024. This shows that Armenia wants NATO as a peacekeeper, and that it wants nothing to do with Russia anymore. Now, we have to be realistic and say that Armenia joining NATO is nearly impossible. It's hard to join the alliance while having a border dispute. But the country hopes to get what's called an individually tailored partnership program, which offers some degree of security. For Putin, though, having American troops in the Caucasus is unthinkable. From recent history, we know that the Kremlin doesn't accept nations trying to get out of its orbit. Back in 2008, the president of Georgia pushed for both NATO and EU membership. This was one of the triggers for the Russo-Georgian War starting in August of that year. And the war in Ukraine also shares some similarities, because Russia thought Ukraine was getting too close to NATO and the EU. Russian propagandists called Pashinyan's pivot to the West an example of Ukrainianization, and said that he's actively following in the footsteps of Ukrainian President Zelensky. Russian-backed media outlets in Armenia claim that his policies will turn Armenia into a shooting range and a battlefield between Russia and the West. It would lead to the loss of Armenian statehood, a threat that we now know to be very serious considering the coup attempt. This toxic reaction from the Russian side also has to do with Armenia's stance on the Russia-Ukraine war. Last year, Armenia began to provide humanitarian aid to Ukraine, and the wife of the prime minister went for a visit to Kyiv. Meanwhile, the Armenian government said that relying on Russia was a mistake, hinting at its invasion into Ukraine. Pashinyan made it clear that we are not Russia's ally in the war with Ukraine, and our feelings from that war, from that conflict, is anxiety because it directly affects all our relationships. Russia condemned Armenia for the move, rejecting the transfer of humanitarian aid to Kyiv's Nazi regime. Later, diplomacy between the two nations went even further downhill. Armenia froze its CSTO membership, meaning that it no longer actively participates with the collective defense. In 2023, it was already skipping CSTO military exercises. It was also absent at an important CSTO summit, which Russia claimed was an anti-Russian move orchestrated by the West. Russia's foreign ministry spokeswoman said that the West is now gripping Armenia, trying to tear it away from Russia. It's only a matter of time until Armenia pulls out of the treaty. The Armenian PM said that the more no answers are heard, the more Armenia is distancing itself from the CSTO with every minute and second. He even claimed that the CSTO creates threats for Armenia's security and Armenia's future existence, sovereignty, and statehood. This is a total shift from the previous relationship the countries had. A spokesman of the Kremlin reacted to this, saying that the CSTO cannot and does not pose any danger, any threat to the sovereignty of Armenia. On the contrary, this organization stands guard over the sovereignty of its member states. Perhaps Pashinyan meant that the CSTO itself creates an illusion of safety, while it actually does nothing for the member states itself. To make the diplomatic relations even worse, Armenia recently sent a diplomat to the town of Bucha in Ukraine to view the site where Russia allegedly massacred Ukrainian civilians. Russia, of course, condemned this visit, as they claimed that the Bucha massacre was made up. But more importantly, they don't like to see their supposed ally, Armenia, visiting enemy territory. In a way, this visit was the symbolic ending of Armenia's alliance with Russia. With all of this in mind, we should also look at the bigger picture. The effects of losing the friendship with Armenia will be huge for Russia. Armenia was Moscow's only ally in the southern Caucasus, a region that Putin likes to think is within Russia's sphere of influence. Currently, Russia has 2 military bases in Armenia, one in Gyumri and one Air Force base near Yerevan. The former hosts about 3,000 troops. If the government in Yerevan decides to pull out of their alliance, though, Russia has to withdraw its troops and abandon its bases in Armenia. The Kremlin already had to remove some soldiers recently. A nightmare scenario is that Russia has to leave, while the Americans and the Europeans are allowed to build new bases. That's a part of the reason why Russia wants regime change in Armenia. Apart from Armenia, Russia doesn't actually have any real allies in the Caucasus. Its relationship with Georgia is slowly improving, but Moscow really shot itself in the foot with the Georgia invasion in 2008. Russia continues to occupy some disputed territories in the country, so the two nations, they still have their problems. With Azerbaijan, the relationship is more complicated. Azerbaijan has gotten very close with the West because of its oil and gas interests. It trades a lot with the EU, and it has long been a part of NATO's Partnership for Peace program. Russia's relations with Azerbaijan are on the improving end, but they're far from close allies. Russia's standing in the region is very important, because there are a lot of competitors for influence in the Caucasus. Apart from Russia, the US, and Europe, you also have Turkey and Iran. Turkey is loosely allied with the West, but it has its own objectives in the region. The country is actually one of the main military backers of Azerbaijan. The nations view each other as two brotherly countries from time immemorial. Turkey is one of the few countries congratulating Azerbaijan on its victory in Nagorno-Karabakh. Because of Turkey's genocide on Armenians under the Ottoman Empire, this makes Armenians very upset. Iran is also involved in the region because of its proximity. It doesn't like Azerbaijan because of its NATO and Israel connections, so Iran has become a big supporter for Armenia, despite being much closer to Azerbaijan culturally. In a way, the government in Tehran is trying to fill the gaps that Russia has left behind. Reportedly, Iran and Armenia have signed a $500 million arms deal, including the infamous suicide drones. Also, Iranian officials have said they support the safe return of Artsakh Armenians and want them to live there in peace. Long story short, this geopolitical situation is incredibly complex. If Armenia wants NATO support, it will likely upset Iran and Russia. NATO also can't overplay its hand in the country because that will upset its ally, Turkey, and spoil its lucrative relations with Azerbaijan.